Thank you very much for having me here today. And it is my absolute pleasure to be here among the people of Chennai. This is a city we admire so much for its intellectual depth, for its ability to debate. It has produced leaders in every walk of life at the national and international level. And I just want to say at the very start, before I welcome all our participants in the debate to come on stage today and share their thoughts, that I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the Times Group, on behalf of Times Now, and on behalf of myself and my team who have come in from Mumbai for allowing us to bring this debate to you before all of you. So thank you all very much for coming. Should we start the debate? Is that a loud yes? I like my audience to participate in the debate. My debates are a little noisy, as you know. I am told that I should restrain my guests. I say I cannot even restrain myself. It gives me great pleasure to first welcome all my 6 participants today, who I will thereafter introduce to join me on both sides of this panel today. Please give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Give them a round of applause. To all my panelists, to the people of Chennai, to the wonderful audience this afternoon, thank you for joining me on this very important occasion of the Times Uncompromise Debate here in Chennai. The subject which we will put to debate, and there's always a for the motion and against the motion in the debate. Does judicial activism really compromise executive powers? We have 3 speakers for the motion and 3 speakers against the motion. I'm not putting the motion to vote at the end of this debate, but all of you in the audience and everyone who is going to watch this, millions of people across the length and breadth of our country, will make up their minds on where they stand and who's the winner and who's the loser. Against the motion, does judicial activism really compromise executive powers? In other words, very strongly in favor of judicial intervention, not interference. I have to my right, and please give them a round of applause as I welcome them, Dr. Subramaniam Swami, senior advocate and president of the Janata Party, now with the NDA, fighting the 2G battle against the government. Fighting very hard, if I may say so. Former member of the Planning Commission, cabinet minister, someone who's been at the Indian Statistical Institute and Harvard. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Swami. To Dr. Swami's right, we have former cabinet secretary to the government of India, IAS officer from the 1961 batch, if I am not mistaken. He studied at Imperial College, London, has a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, TSR Subramaniam. To his right, one of the most respected legal luminaries in India today, former Chief Justice of the Punjab and Haryana High Court, Judge of the Delhi High Court. He's a graduate from Hindu College and has done his LLB from Delhi University. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Justice Mukul Mugdal. Thank you very much. And that's the team that is going to be against the motion today, speaking very, very strongly for judicial intervention. Now, speaking against the motion to my left, I have great pleasure in introducing. It's interesting to have a lawyer speak for the motion. You know you're speaking against judicial intervention to some extent. There's a C. Aryaman Sundaram, one of the best-known lawyers of the Supreme Court today. He's a gold medalist from the University of Madras. He was the youngest lawyer, if I'm not mistaken, to be a senior advocate of the High Court here. In 2001, moved to the Supreme Court, and today is one of the foremost lawyers in the country's highest court. Mr. Sundaram, thank you for joining me today. To his left, we have former Mumbai Police Commissioner, M.N. Singh. He's the man who led the investigations into the serial blast in 1993. He has led all the difficult and sensitive departments in Mumbai, whether it's the Anti-Corruption Bureau, whether it's being Chief of Crime, and he has won the President's Police Medal for his distinguished services. It's interesting to have an IPS officer on the panel. Mr. M.N. Singh, thank you for joining me. And to his left, former Comptroller and Auditor General CAG of India, Mr. Vijendra Kaul. Mr. Vijendra Kaul has been one of the foremost IAS officers, civil servants of our country. He is also not from the 61, I think from the 65 batch, from the Madhya Pradesh cadre. He's worked in the United Nations for several years, and today he represents the wealth of opinion that says, no, we must draw the line, and there must be a Lakshman Rekha which must not be crossed by the judiciary in dealing with the executive or with any other part of our Indian institutions. Thank you very much, Mr. Kaul. Thank you to all my panelists. Now, usually in a debate, we have people speaking for the motion who set the debate right. I just want to quote James Madison, the 4th President of the United States of America, who said, and you can use this whichever way you want, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether in terms of one person or a few people, whether by hereditary nature, whether in an elected nature or a self-appointed nature, may justly be pronounced to be the very definition of tyranny. Ladies and gentlemen, do judicial decisions breach bounds of constitutional propriety and permissibility? Is judicial activism a requirement to defend a common man's interest? Is it the last court of appeal for the Aam Aadmi? Isn't it true that judicial activism doesn't exist in a vacuum? It is forced. It is the result of our circumstances. It may be a result of the executive failures in carrying out its own duties. Some food for thought, ladies and gentlemen. Our first speaker in this debate today, speaking against the motion, strongly in favor of judicial interference, is former Chief Justice of the Punjab and Haryana High Court, retired Justice Mukul Mugdal. Please.
Thank you. When one pillar of democracy is dysfunctional or comatose, the other pillars must occupy the space. When the executive does not do its job, then the judiciary has to step in. You said the example of Lakshman Rekha. This is not the mythical Lakshman Rekha. This is a flexible one. The judicial intervention must be temporary, must correct the course, then come back. If it were not for judicial activism, forgotten and weak sections of our society, like prisoners, mentally ill, bonded and construction labor, silent sufferers like rivers, forests, and nature would not have had any audience, anybody to look after them. And it is only because of judicial activism do you see that our environment is being preserved, our forgotten and weak sections of the society are getting a glimpse of what the Constitution promises them. And kindly remember what public interest has brought out. Constitution appointments by unfit persons, as is the case of Central Vigilance Commissioner. In the High Courts, some examples I'd like to give you. You all remember in Punjab and Haryana there have been honor killings. Today, there are safe homes for the possible victims of honor killings for 15 days, absolutely safely, with protection. The young couple is given security and a place to stay. The only thing I would say where the court should draw a line is when it appoints these empowered committees to go into environment, mining, other related issues. No committee should be permanent. It should be temporary. Eventually the power must go back to the executive or the judiciary itself. The auction has one problem, that if you can't auction land, supposing school is to be given land, it cannot compete with an industry, or it cannot compete with another rich school. A poor children's school should get school by land by allotment. And lastly, I would say that things like water, if they are privatized and auctioned, then the poor would never get it because the profit motive will prevail.
Justice Mugdal, thank you very much for introductory comments. It can also be argued, Mr. Mugdal, that has the judiciary lost faith in the wish of the executive, or the earnestness or genuineness of the executive in implementing the fundamental rights and defending the fundamental liberties of the people? We'll take that debate forward. Our second speaker, Sundaram, speaking for the motion. Mr. Sundaram.
Justice Mudgal is very correct when he said that the origin of judicial activism was really to reach the people who didn't get justice, to reach the downtrodden, to reach the people who required a lot of help to safeguard their fundamental rights. Unfortunately, that is not where we are now. It started there, like many good starts 3 decades ago, Justice Krishna Iyer and other eminent judges who started it. Today, we have gone into a different sphere. And when we talk about judicial activism today, invariably this activism means intruding into the executive functions. By executive, I include the legislative functions, which goes against the very basis of the separation of power. Let us not forget that essential to the Indian democracy, an essential part of our constitution, is the separation of power. And no matter how great the excuse, how great the felt justification may be, that is one Lakshman Rekha which should not be crossed because it strikes at the basis of a democracy. My whole concern with judicial activism are what I call the 4 C's. The first is clarity, or the lack of clarity. I say it is the lack of clarity because what is judicial activism? When does judicial activism cross that very thin line and become judicial overreaching? When does it cross yet another thin line and become judicial jingoism? There has to be some kind of clarity as to the limits within which this judicial activism can be exercised. It can be exercised to safeguard fundamental rights. In fact, that is the duty of the judiciary. There is no doubt about it. But when you go into policy, you are intruding into executive function, and there is a complete lack of clarity as to where that Lakshman Rekha lies. The second is consistency, or the lack of consistency. I say this because unlike the Supreme Court of the United States, which sits en masse, all judges of the Supreme Court sit together for every case, or judges of the Supreme Court of England, where they sit at least 5. In India, invariably judges sit in benches of 2, rarely 3, and even more rarely 5. So in effect, you have 12 different benches of the Supreme Court. Each decision of any one bench of the Supreme Court is a decision of the Supreme Court itself. So whereas one bench may feel it is the judicial function to be active and to involve itself into an executive function in some way or the other, another bench may think to the opposite and say this is no role at all for the judiciary to play. And therefore there's a lack of consistency. The third big problem I find is concession, the third big C, concession by the executive, which always is the rule. A weak executive, a weak parliament, a weak government gives rise to a strong judiciary. And unfortunately, as we have found in the past, a very strong executive weakens a judiciary which we had about 40 years ago. The fact of the matter is that this concession by the executive is actually allowing the judiciary to overreach in many cases. And finally, the last C, an area which really concerns me and which worries me, is the area of what I call conflict. Why conflict? Who is to decide whether the judicial activism is overreaching and intruding into executive powers or not? We are talking about a matter where you have in the separation of powers the judiciary on one side, the executive on the other. We have a case where the question arises, is the judiciary or the judicial activism really impinging on executive action? And who is to decide that? One of the parties to the very cause, the judiciary itself. The judiciary decides whether it is actually intruding into executive functions or not. It is like a dispute between A and B, and you ask A to decide the dispute. Now the fact of the matter is, the Constitution is very clear in the constitutional functions of the executive, the legislature and the judiciary. As far as possible, we have to stick to it, however tempting it may be otherwise. I just want to conclude my introductory comments with what Justice Frankfurter, the famous judge of the Supreme Court of the United States, said. If judges want to be preachers, they should dedicate themselves to the pulpit. If they want to be basic policy makers, Parliament is their place. Judges who do both are most indefensible offenders in government under law. And I quote a judge of the Supreme Court of the United States who said this while sitting as a judge of the Supreme Court.
To which it can also be said that Thomas Jefferson also said that the execution of the law Mr. Sundaram, is more important than the making of them. And when the executive fails in the execution of the law, the judiciary therefore has to intervene, as it did on the 2nd of February 2012, when it gave its phenomenal 2G judgment.
But it cannot make the law. It can ensure execution of law, but it cannot itself make law. While it can say something has been wrongly done by the government, or something ought to be done, it cannot say how the government is to do it.
Since I have committed the cardinal sin of being unable to restrain myself once again into the debate, I welcome our third speaker today, Mr. TSR Subramaniam, on the subject of judicial activism and whether it encroaches into executive powers.
Thank you, Arnab. Let me start with the first point that I am not a constitutional expert like Justice Mudgal or Arnab Sundaram. I am only an observer who has seen the Constitution working in practice over the past 30, 40, 50 years. Let me make a comment on the Constitution in my own limited observation. The second one, Mr. Sundaram, is India is not America. The conditions are different, situation is different, politics is different. Politics is different. In the American system, all power is given to one person. The huge checks and balances are there in the form of the parliament, parliamentary committees. Every appointment has to be cleared, including Thomas appointment, by a parliamentary committee. It is not given. It is not given to the executive to do that. In the Indian context, we have had I hope I will not be hauled up for contempt for Parliament. If in the past 60 years, if the Parliament had met only for 3 days every year to pass the budget and pass the laws and give a vote of confidence, would the country have been any worse than they are today or any better off? I go back to the Constitution on what is the Supreme Court or the Apex Court or the judiciary supposed to do. I am now reading from the Constitution. Arnab Sundaram said that they can't be judge, jury and executioner or prosecutor. The first promise of the Constitution is justice for all citizens. That's the first promise, very first sentence. It defines justice: social, economic, political, all-encompassing.
Correct.
So therefore, right from the beginning, the Constitution we have given ourselves gives the Supreme Court as the final arbiter, a final umpire. Naturally, players don't want umpires, particularly powerful players. The Indian system has not been blessed with checks and balances, and therefore those in power for the last 60 years, we have seen what happened to Lokpal. They don't want any umpire to encroach into their territory, and this is clearly, we hear the umpire is coming into his own because the players are misbehaving. I think the entry is permitted. The Supreme Court clearly has the right to intervene if the right to life is affected, quality of life is affected, the healthy principles are not met. Article 14, 21, 32. I would go further to say, if in these circumstances, when you see abysmal poverty levels, when you see the worst education system in the world, when Indian health conditions are inferior to sub-Saharan Africa, the Supreme Court not only has the powers, it has got the duty to intervene. They have to tell the executive that these are areas you must come in and do something about. It is very important. I think there is no Lakshman Rekha. If there is a Lakshman Rekha, that Rekha, as Justice Mudgal said, is to be established from time to time by the court itself. And the powers of the court are inherent. They are not given by you or I. They are not given by the judiciary, by the executive. They are not given by the parliament. The powers are inherent. There is no question of overreach and jingoism. They are only doing the duty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Subramaniam.